with the word bully. And my favorite word, you see. Whenever I heard anything that I thought was particularly keen, I would shout out, bully. So, if you hear anything from this platform here this morning that strikes your fancy, I want you to just shout out, bully. So, yeah, let's try that together. Ready? 3, 2, 1, bully! Almost as loud as they did it in my day, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask a few questions before we get started. About your life in your era now. Is change happening more than you can essentially keep up with today? And how many of those changes did you get a vote in? Not many. So what do you suppose is the best strategy for dealing with change? Hint. It's not to resist change. Yeah, it's to adjust to that change. Let me tell you about a few of the changes that occurred throughout my lifetime. You see, I was born in 1858. The primary mode of transportation in those days was what? The horse. Indeed. I was quite a horseman throughout my life, throughout my career. And you see, in my lifetime, I saw us move from the horse to the automobile. Okay? Well, there were sailing ships that were the primary mode of transportation across the seas. And in my lifetime, I saw us move from sailing ships to submarines and aircraft carriers in one lifetime. Okay? We went from horses to automobiles, and there was a couple of young men who lived in Ohio that had a bicycle shop. But then they invented what? The aeroplane. In my lifetime, from the horse to the automobile to the aeroplane. You see, I was the first president. I embraced change. I was the first president ever to fly in an aeroplane. Oh, what a bully experience that was. It was 1910, St. Louis. The fellow's name was Arch Hoxsey. He was the pilot. Hoxsey, his name was. And it was an aeroplane not unlike that aeroplane that the Wright brothers flew there on Kitty Hawk. And, you know, there was no seats for passengers, so they took a chair not unlike the kind of chair you're sitting on right now, and they sawed off the legs, and they strapped it to the struts. And that's the seat I sat in. And we went up for about 10 or 15 minutes and flew around St. Louis, and what a bully experience that was. Unfortunately, about a year later, Arch Hoxsey, the pilot, died in a crash in that same aeroplane. Now, some of my political opponents had wished that I was on that flight, too. Some other changes that occurred. Communication. If you wanted to communicate where I came from in New York with someone in California, well, we had the Pony Express. And then there was a young fellow who grew up across the Hudson from me. His name was Samuel F.B. Morse. Perhaps you know of him. He invented something called the Morse code and the telegraph. So you know, with the Pony Express, you could send a message, a letter out to California and expect a response back within, what, a month or two. But with the telegraph now, you could send a message out and expect a response back with, what, a day or two. And then there was another young fellow who grew up not too far from where I lived. His name was Alexander Graham Bell, invented something called the telephone. I thought that was quite an ingenious device, but it became rather annoying, I thought. You see, I was the first president to ever install telephones in their home. The White House, you see, I don't know what's happening here. It's the Secret Service detail has run amok. You know, the Secret Service detail came into being during my presidency. Oftentimes historians call me the accidental president because I became president through rather tragic circumstances. It was President McKinley who was gunned down by, in those days, we call them anarchists. Today, you would call them terrorists, indeed, in Buffalo, New York. And I was the vice president at the time. You see, I was out with my family camping in the Adirondack Mountains. And a courier came up on horseback and said, "Mr. President, you need to come to Buffalo, New York." Because it was in Buffalo where the president had been shot. And I took the oath of office, actually in a home. It was called the Wilcox Mansion. It's still there today. In fact, the National Park Service operates it as a museum. So if you ever find yourself in Buffalo, New York, Delaware Avenue is where the Wilcox Mansion is, and you can actually stand where I stood to take the oath of office as the 26th President of the United States. So, I was the first president to install telephones in my home in Long Island because, the summers in Washington, D.C., well, you just don't want to live there during the summer. And so Congress would vacate. And I went to my home in Sagamore Hill, and a town called Oyster Bay, and we installed telephones. And I thought they were a good device at first, but, what I found was that before we installed telephones, if someone wanted to talk with me, they had to make an appointment. But once we had telephones, they thought they could interrupt me at any hour of the day or night. And I look today, and in today's world, people wear their telephones. How weird is that? They become part of your clothing, I guess. But people can be contacted anytime. So in my lifetime, again, we went from the Pony Express to the telegraph to the telephone in one lifetime. When I was born, life expectancy was 45 years. And, pharmaceutical science and medical device science had progressed till today, life expectancy is what? Close to 80, isn't it? Getting close to 100. In fact, I was reading one of your newspapers the other day, and it said the first person to live to the age of 150 has already been born. So think about that. Okay? What progress we've made, if you can call that progress, perhaps. Bully! You see, there's a lot of changes that take place in our life, and embracing change. I was the first president, again, to ride in an airplane. I was the first president to ever go underwater in a submarine. It was the Navy had their first submarine while I was president, and it was an interesting name. It was the USS Plunger. Boy, I don't know who named it, but I was in my home, Sagamore Hill on Oyster Bay, and the Navy pulled up their submarine, and I thought it would be a bully experience to go underwater and drive that thing. And while I was president, I sneaked away from my Secret Service detail that day, and spent about 3 hours underwater in Long Island Sound. Now, when the Democrats heard about that, they were excited because it was a dangerous mission. And they thought, let him go on that submarine, he'll never resurface. Okay. I was the first president to drive an automobile. And that was own and drive my own automobile, which was quite an experience, you see, because I was a horseman. And, we didn't have paved roads in those days. They were essentially trails. And, my horses were trained to avoid the ruts. Okay? And so I didn't have to pay attention to the trail. That was the horse's job. Now, when I was driving a car, whole different story. I think I wrecked the first 3 cars I had because I drove them into the ditch, into the ruts. Because it was the horse's job to do it. I thought it was the car's job to do that. But again, I embraced that change. I was the first president to invite a black man to dinner at the White House, and that was Booker T. Washington, indeed. Took a lot of political flack for that, but I did it. It took courage to do a lot of those things, and I learned that very early on. You see, I was born in New York City on 20th Street. Anyone from New York City? Bully. 20th Street. In fact, my home is still there. The National Park Service operates it as a museum. So if you find yourself in New York City, just off of Broadway on 20th Street, you can visit my birthplace. Well, when I was growing up there as a young child, I was smaller than most of the other kids there, and I couldn't see very well. And so my father bought me these spectacles. And the first day I went out on the street to play with the other children with my spectacles on, well, what do you suppose they called me? 4 Eyes. Indeed. And I had to muster up the courage at a very young age to face these other children who were calling me names, calling me 4 Eyes. So I learned that on the streets of New York. Well, a few years later, you see, I was in my early 20s, thought I wanted to be a cowboy. So I went out west. Went out to what was known as the Dakota Territories. Today is the state of North Dakota. Well, before I left, I commissioned my favorite haberdasher, Brooks Brothers, to fashion me some of the finest cowboy clothes you could ever imagine. Perhaps you've seen some of the photographs of me in my buckskins with the fringe. You see? And I took all my Brooks Brothers cowboy clothes out west. You see, I took a train from New York to Chicago, and from Chicago we had a charter a little private wagon who took me into the little town of Medora in the Dakota Territories. I also took along with me a library of the classics. You see, I was reading Anna Karenina on the back of the wagon as we pulled into the Dakota Territories. Probably was the only person west of the Mississippi with that sort of a library. Well, when I got off the wagon and I was met by the locals there, what do you suppose they called me? I had my spectacles on, 4 eyes. And they called me the city dude. They had never seen, cowboy duds tailored by Brooks Brothers before. And I had to muster up the courage to face these fellas, you see. There were many things I was afraid of at first. Mean horses, grizzly bears, gunfighters. But I learned that if you acted as if you were not afraid, you gradually ceased to be afraid. And you could face any obstacle in your life. And I learned that out west, you see, because they challenged me. When you go out west in those days, they challenged you. And I had to prove myself. And I was challenged to a fight. What they didn't know was that while I was at Harvard, I took boxing. And I never lost a fight out west. Bully. Well, of course, I was only in one. And I put that other man out cold. Bully. They made me sheriff of the entire territory within a month of my arrival. And then a few years later, courage came into play once more. I was Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President McKinley. Oh, a bully position. I loved the Navy. In fact, the very first book I ever wrote, I was still in college. I was at Harvard. And, I wrote 38 books throughout my lifetime, I understand they're all still in print. Bully. Yeah, I understand they're all still in print today. And the year is what, 2011? Goodness gracious. The very first book I wrote was The Naval Battles of the War of 1812. And it became required reading on naval ships and a required reading at the Naval Academy at Annapolis. Hope it still is. I'm not sure. But I was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which was a good job because the Secretary of the Navy, Long, didn't like Washington, D.C., so he was never there. And he left the care of the United States Navy in my stead. I was the one who gave Dewey the order to go to Manila. Bully. And you see, there was another tragic event that occurred in our history, and that was in Havana Harbor. The USS Maine was blown up by the Spanish. And I went to President McKinley after 276 American sailors slaughtered that day. And I went to President McKinley and I said, let me put together some troopers, and I'll go to Cuba and avenge the loss of those sailors. And we put together the first United States Volunteer Cavalry. The boys in the press had a nickname for us. They called us the Rough Riders. It wasn't a name I was fancy on at first, but it grew on me, you see. And we were going to be a cavalry unit. So we went out to Texas to train. Well, that's where the horses were. So we went to Texas. And you see, I didn't have much military training. I spent a few short weeks in the New York State Militia when I was a young man. So I knew that if we were going to put together a crack cavalry unit, we needed a good military man. So I found one. He was the personal surgeon to President McKinley. And he and I went out to Texas and put together these troopers. And when we were ready to go, we loaded all of our horses and all of our men on trains, went to Tampa, Florida.